Until recently, Donald Trump had praised Egyptian leader Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, but his government is now withholding millions of dollars in aid, citing concerns over human rights abuses. So, is there a shift in U.S. policy when it comes to Egypt? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. Egypt has been a longtime ally of the United States, but that relationship was strained after the 2013 military coup that put President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi in power. That all changed when President Donald Trump came to office in January. Sisi was one of the first leaders to visit him at the White House. Human rights groups have accused Sisi's government of extensive human rights violations. Now Trump's administration is withholding nearly $300 million in aid over the same concerns. We have a lot to get to with our guests. First, though, this report from Heidi Jo Castro in Washington.
In April, when Abdel Fattah el-Sisi became the first Egyptian president to visit Washington in almost a decade, U.S. President Donald Trump set aside the Egyptian government's human rights scandals to welcome its leader with fanfare and praise.
That we are very much behind President el-Sisi. He's done a fantastic job in a very difficult situation.
Just 4 months later, the U.S. says it's taking punitive action on Egypt, canceling $95.7 million in military and economic aid and withholding a further $195 million until Egypt shows progress in respecting civil liberties. A U.S. State Department official explained the decision Tuesday, stating U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has decided that it is in the interest of the United States to exercise a national security waiver. We remain concerned about Egypt's lack of progress in key areas, including human rights and the new NGO law. That law took effect in May and restricts non-governmental organizations in Egypt to developmental and social work. It also introduces jail terms of up to 5 years for non-compliance. Human rights activists say the law is part of Sisi's growing crackdown on dissent since seizing power in a military coup in 2013. A bipartisan group of U.S. senators echoed that concern in June, delivering a letter to Trump that states, under the leadership of President el-Sisi, the Egyptian government has systematically cracked down on civil society groups and independent media, jailed tens of thousands of political prisoners, and used violence and intimidation against individuals critical of the government. But Trump himself has not publicly criticized Egypt, instead calling Sisi his friend during a meeting in Riyadh in May. Sisi, in turn, praised Trump for being capable of doing the impossible. Given the cozy optics between the two, at the time, U.S. actions to punish Egypt had seemed improbable, if not impossible. And some policy experts say Tuesday's announcement to withhold nearly $200 million in U.S. aid to Egypt is merely an empty threat. Egypt can get the money in the future by meeting still unspecified conditions.
Frankly, a much tougher consequence from the U.S. would have been an outright refusal from Secretary Tillerson to say, you haven't made these conditions, including on the NGO law, and therefore we cannot move this money forward. We'll need to spend it elsewhere.
Nevertheless, many human rights advocates say the U.S.'s actions, using dollars to condemn Egypt, are a step in the right direction. Heidi Jo Castro, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's take a closer look now at relations between Egypt and the United States. In 1978, Egypt signed a peace deal with Israel brokered by the U.S. It led to billions of dollars in aid for both countries. Over a decade later, Egypt became one of the first Arab states to send troops to help the U.S. during the first Gulf War. In 1999, the two allies strengthened their economic relationship by signing a trade and development agreement. 4 years later, Egypt supported the United States during the 2003 invasion of Iraq. In 2009, former President Barack Obama delivered a speech to the Islamic world from Cairo University. And earlier this year, the U.S. said it wants to resume military exercises with Egypt, which were put on hold during the Arab Spring. Let's bring in our panel now. Timothy Kaldas, a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Politics, joining us from Barcelona. In Washington, Richelle Dunne, former Middle East specialist at the U.S. State Department. And in London, Maha Azam, co-founder of Egyptians for Democracy. And welcome to all of you. Timothy, I'm going to start with you. How would you characterize this move? Is it a surprise?
I mean, it's definitely out of sync with the statements that we've received from the president in the past on the issue of human rights and this government in Egypt. He's been very supportive of President Sisi, and on the campaign trail suggested that human rights weren't a priority during a war on terrorism. That said, it is in sync with what we've been hearing from people in the Senate, and there's definitely a lot of concerns within the U.S. government, particularly on this NGO law that imposes very draconian restrictions on Egyptian civil society, as well as complicates the ability of the U.S. government to fund programs that it sees as essential for Egypt's development.
Okay, and we're going to come back to the impact of the law and some of the things you touched on in just a moment. First, though, Michelle, what do you make of the timing of this? Is it in any way related to the violence that has been happening to the Coptic Christians, or what's your theory on why this is happening?
Well, I think it's happening now for two reasons. One of them is that some of this assistance, and I will probably discuss this in more detail, was actually set to expire as of September 30th. And so the administration needed to take action one way or another regarding some of the assistance. The other issue, I think, is related to President Sisi's ratification of the NGO law, which came as a very negative surprise to the Trump administration. They thought they had assurances that Sisi was not going to ratify the law. And so it's taken them a couple of months, but that sort of, I think, got things moving in terms of them wanting to react. So,
Maha, this does seem, as Timothy pointed out, a bit out of step with some of the rhetoric that has come from Donald Trump, who seemed to really like the Egyptian president. So what do you make of this conflict, what appears to be at least a difference of the way the State Department is approaching Sisi and the way Donald Trump spoke of him?
I think there is a realization both in Washington and elsewhere in Western capitals that the policies that General Sisi has been pursuing in terms of human rights violations since the coup of 2013 are detrimental even to those who want an alliance or partnership based on security and trade interests. That ultimately, yes, the NGO is only one aspect of what's happening in Egypt. It is detrimental to civil society, but Egypt now is undergoing a military regime, is experiencing the reality of a military regime that represses, where there is a lack of the rule of law and any respect for human rights. And I think policymakers are realizing that that is a recipe for instability. And I agree that the issue of aid to Egypt was going to come up anyway. And we did hear at one point that there would be a cutting back of aid to various countries. And Egypt is one such country. I do hope, though, that this is a step in the right direction. It is very little in many ways, and it has cost lives, and it has cost Egyptian citizens a great deal of suffering. It doesn't mean that it will ultimately be productive, but it is an important signal to the Sisi regime and to the citizens of Egypt at this stage.
Michelle, let's talk about the money since you brought that up. What actual impact will this have financially on Egypt?
Well, I don't see any impact, significant impact on Egypt financially. What happened was there was almost $100 million of assistance from past years that has actually been canceled, will not go to Egypt. About 68 million of that was military assistance and 30 million was economic assistance. And what's significant here is this is the first time, I believe, that military assistance in particular has been canceled explicitly due to a human rights concern. So there's about $100 million from previous year's assistance that was sitting in the pipeline that has been taken away from Egypt, will be given to other countries. The other thing that was done is that there is current assistance, $195 million of military assistance from fiscal year 2017. fiscal year 2016 rather, that was suspended temporarily due to human rights conditions written into the legislation for this assistance. And what Secretary Tillerson did was he used the national security waiver to waive, so to speak, the human rights conditions in order to prevent that assistance from just also being canceled, this additional $195 million. So it has not been canceled, but it has been placed on a shelf, so to speak. What the State Department is saying is that that assistance is not being canceled. However, it's being set aside, and Egypt will not be allowed to spend any of that additional assistance until it meets some conditions, which appear to be related to human rights. But I think there are several issues. I think there are human rights conditions, and I think there are other things relating to the Sinai and to North Korea as well.
So, Timothy, is this an opportunity? Is the State Department trying to use this as an opportunity to extract changes out of Egypt, considering the money, as Michelle just said, the money's not going away, they just can't get it right now?
I mean, that might be the intention. I'm not sure if they're going to see the NGO law go away in response directly to this move. The government would probably be very reluctant to do that. At the same time, I think it does send a really important signal that despite Trump's rhetoric, the U.S. government still will at times pursue consequences for these human rights violations, because Trump's words coming into office really kind of gave a lot of authoritarians in the region a sense that they had a carte blanche to do whatever they pleased. And so it's important, even if it's a symbolic amount, and $200 million, frankly, isn't that huge for them. It is important symbolically that there be a little bit of a walk back from that rhetoric, and that people can see that there could be policy consequences for certain actions.
There's not necessarily any reason to believe that Donald Trump's rhetoric or tweets will change in the future. If they continue, do these effectively counteract these actions as opposed to the things that he may continue to say?
Well, I think that fundamentally this is not an Egyptian issue now. This is an issue with the foreign policy of the Trump administration. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of inconsistency. There's plenty of contradictions. We saw it with the crisis in Qatar. Statements coming from Trump were very different from statements coming out of the State Department and our ambassador in Qatar, who eventually resigned. I mean, fundamentally, there's been a lack of coherence with the administration's foreign policy and a complete lack of control in terms of messaging coming from Trump's Twitter account. I think that this, though, shows that while Trump may have words that are encouraging or comforting for dictators, there still could be material consequences that are out of sync with those words, and so people still have to take that into consideration and can't just take Trump at his word that he'll let them do whatever they like.
Maha, tell me what the practical impact of this NGO law is.
The impact is very severe. It has meant much less freedom or no freedom at all for NGOs that have functioned in Egypt, providing some very important charitable work and awareness work on the ground, and sustenance also for political activists. All this has been clamped on very severely under Sisi like never before. Ultimately, those involved in NGO work are liable to imprisonment up to 5 years, and also all funding will be suspended. So they will be monitoring very carefully or have stopped funding that's coming from outside Egypt or from any source. So essentially, it's an attempt to halt the work of independent NGOs.
Michelle, Sisi would say that this crackdown on his opponents is about security in his country. Are there countries in the West that buy that?
Well, look, I think there are countries in the West that do have a lot of concerns about security in Egypt. Egypt has a serious terrorism problem, right? I mean, there's an insurgency in the Sinai. There are increasingly cells affiliated with ISIS in the Egyptian mainland, carrying out attacks on Christians and so forth. So it's a serious terrorism problem. And there's a lot of worry, particularly in Europe, about the economic situation in Egypt, which is really becoming quite dire, and the possibility of massive migration, either of Egyptians or people from elsewhere in the African continent transiting Egypt and coming to Europe. So there's plenty of concern about security in Egypt. But I do think that both in the United States and in Europe, there's a lot of questioning as to Sisi's methods and whether a crackdown on all political opposition, on the media, on human rights groups, and now this very broad crackdown on civil society. What does this have to do with the security threats? This really looks more like Sisi just trying to silence his critics. And so, you know, we're seeing a reaction to that. The other thing I think regarding the NGO law is that the United States has traditionally given its economic assistance to Egypt through NGOs. And that's even government to government, say educational programs, health programs that are agreed between the two governments are often implemented by NGOs, either in Egyptian NGOs or American NGOs working in Egypt. This new NGO law makes that almost impossible. And so part of the signal here is that the United States is saying, through passing these draconian laws, you're making it really difficult for us to help you, Egypt, at a time when you very much need it. So, you know, that's the signal. As I said, I think people in the administration thought that Sisi was not going to ratify this bill from the parliament and make it law. And then he did, and he did it right after meeting with Trump in Riyadh. Which sort of made it look as though Trump had given the green light for that.
What do you make of that timing?
I think was not what was intended.
Okay, Timothy, let me ask you.
Well, that's what it looked like, you know. It looked as though President...
No, I'm sorry, Michelle. I wanted to bring Timothy in on that point. Do you agree with what Michelle is saying about the timing? Timothy?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the series of crackdowns that we saw immediately following Riyadh were interpreted by a lot of people to be a consequence of Trump signaling that a wave of authoritarian crackdowns were okay. A lot of people pinpointed the timing in association with that visit to Riyadh and the summit that was held there. So undoubtedly, the White House was perceived as partly responsible for that.
Maha, how does this decision to withhold this money, how, if at all, does it serve Sisi's opponents, and particularly the Muslim Brotherhood?
I think the issue is one of the degree of support that has been given to General Sisi since the coup by the United States and others. And as we've heard, I think, from all the participants today, this is something of, it's symbolic. It has some importance, but ultimately it's not going to change anything, whether in terms of the opposition to Sisi or the reaction of Sisi to his opponents. Let me put it this way. There is an ongoing struggle, political struggle with the military regime. Its opponents and those that are suffering in Egypt today, and that is the majority of Egyptian citizens, are not looking only to a cut in aid to Egypt. They're looking to the end of the military regime in Egypt that is supported ultimately by the United States and its allies. These are symbolic gestures that have come, you can say it's too little, too late, and whatever the reasoning behind it in the United States, the repression that is happening in Egypt is tantamount to the reality of an authoritarian state. We have over 60,000 political prisoners in Egypt. There is no freedom of assembly or freedom of speech in that country. Political opponents are tortured in prison and do not have the right to due process. The issue is not just about an NGO law. It is about the fact that Egyptians are denied the right to freedom and rights. And therefore, I think whether it's the opposition or the ordinary man or woman on the street will react to this with very little. The reaction will be minimal. They'll see this as politics being played out at one level that really doesn't affect their lives. The United States needs to do much more than than what it's done today.
Okay,
it's
so
a symbolic gesture,
Maha.
an important one, but not enough.
Okay, so having said all of that, all of the things, Timothy, go ahead. Timothy, go ahead.
I was just saying, I just spoke with friends in Cairo earlier today. I think the reaction is mostly confusion, to be perfectly honest with you. I think that they're confused from the mixed messages that have come from the White House. I don't know that that Egyptians are supportive or opposed to this particular step. And in general, they tend to be quite defensive about foreign powers giving instructions to their government. But in general, in this particular case, I think it's mostly just very confusing because it is so out of sync with everything that Trump has said so far. And they're kind of wondering what are the intentions behind this move. There's an assumption that there's an ulterior motive driving this particular cut. Because, I mean, the Sisi government has been violating human rights nonstop for 4 years without really much of a reaction. Even under Obama, there was only a temporary suspension of some of the military aid. We haven't seen actual cuts. So it is surprising to people that all of a sudden the U.S. took this step. Michelle did a good job of explaining why the timing just happened to have to be right now. But for people in Cairo who are less familiar with these legal technicalities, it just seems very random, and they kind of wonder what's behind it.
So, Michelle, Egypt had a meeting scheduled, a high-level meeting with Jared Kushner and his delegation. That was canceled, right? And Sisi is warning the U.S. that there will be negative consequences for this. Is that a threat to the U.S.? What now? Is this some sort of standoff? What now?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, that's typical. The United States has a couple of times in the past canceled some economic assistance, not military assistance, that's new this time, but economic assistance. And sometimes it has been directly related to human rights concerns. I'm thinking back to an episode more than 10 years ago when Dr. Saadeddin Ibrahim, an Egyptian-American scholar, was was put on trial, in a clearly political case and so forth. And the administration of George W. Bush canceled at that time $133 million of economic assistance. And what we saw was a furious public reaction from the Mubarak government and from the Egyptian media and so forth. And that played out over a couple of months. But actually what happened was 6 months later, Dr. Ibrahim's case was referred to a higher court, and he was acquitted and completely exonerated. So from the point of view of American officials, that attempt to exert some leverage actually worked. It just didn't work immediately. And of course, there's a sense of national pride in Egypt. They don't want to be seen to be dancing to, Washington's tune and so forth. But sometimes there are effects. It just takes a little time to play out. I want to react to what Tim said about people in Egypt being confused. I mean, he's quite right about the confusion and incoherence in Trump administration policies and so forth. But if you have watched the way that the Trump administration has handled Egypt carefully from the beginning, what's been apparent to me was that, yes, while President Trump gave the public embrace and the warm welcome Sisi was looking for, in terms of aid and so forth, the Trump administration has been very careful and has made it very clear they did not load Sisi down with gifts when he was here in Washington in April. They didn't give him anything that he was looking for other than the visit itself. And they said, well, getting other things is going to depend on whether you cooperate with us, the United States. And what we're seeing now, a few months later, is the signal, well, we're not so happy with your cooperation. Okay. Whether it's on the NGO law. I also mentioned there are other issues. We saw that President Trump raised with President Sisi in a telephone call in early July, North Korea. And that's an important issue as well. Okay.
And I could actually let all three of you talk all day. This is a really important conversation, and you all bring something very important to the table. Thank you very much for your time. To Timothy Kaldas, Michelle Dunne, and Maha Azam, thank you all. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime if you visit our website, aljazeera.com. For the discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team. Bye for now.